There is currently no segment more competitive in the Malaysian market than the B segment SUV space. You've got the Honda HR-V, you have the Proton X50, to some extent the Renault Captur. You also have the Corolla Cross, if you're willing to sort of put that there, as well as the Subaru XV. Again, if you're willing to sort of understand what the segment kind of means within that sort of price range. So for Peugeot's new minder BERMAZ to offer the 2008 as their first all-new model as to relaunch the brand under its stewardship, it's a bit of a bold move because, as I said, this segment is very competitive. It's either you get it right or you get it wrong. And if you get it wrong, it's going to be very, very hard to convince buyers to come back. Peugeot has an entire catalogue of cars that they could have introduced, but BERMAZ went with this. Now, quite rightfully, the SUV segment is growing in Malaysia, which means that a B segment SUV would be just the right car, but only if you have just the right car to offer, which is what we will try and find out in this review. My name is Aiman I. Abdullah, this is Malaysian Motoring, and this is our review of the 2022 Peugeot 2008. Now, as I said earlier, offering the 2008 is a very bold move by BERMAZ, but perhaps it's because the 2008 is a very bold car to begin with. Up front, you have this sort of seamless grille that integrates into the bumper with these lovely chrome pins that go all the way across, kind of like what you get in a Mercedes-Benz. You have full LED headlights with this triple claw design with an LED fang that goes all the way to the bottom. Now, unlike the larger 3008 and 508, the fang is not the indicator. It's actually a separate indicator light here, which means this works solely as a daytime running light, which is an interesting sort of design feature. You have fake vents here. You have a real vent up front, however, with a little bit of silver down on the bottom to emphasize that this is ultimately a crossover. Now, that crossoverness sort of extends all the way through the car. You have prominent black cladding all around the car. You have a little bit of silver trim, of course. Now, on all four corners, you'll find 17-inch dual-tone alloy wheels wrapped in Goodyear Assurance Triple Max tires. The design is interesting. It certainly fits this car. And on the profile, you will realize that actually the 2008 is a very upright sort of car. Compared to vehicles like the Renault Captur or the Mazda CX-3, for example, this car seems to enjoy its straight lines quite a lot more. The bonnet, for example, is a very straight sort of thing. The front end is very bluff, so is the rear, and down the side, instead of curves, you get these sort of geometric patterns where it sort of emphasizes that this car is more about the details rather than taking it all in as a whole. Unfortunately, this white color doesn't really pop out a lot of those features, but what does stand out, of course, are the gloss black roof rails and the gloss black C-pillar garnish. Yes, this is not a quarter light, unfortunately, but that is what it is. Now, at the back of the 2008, you get this lovely sloping tailgate with a pert little rear wiper. You get Peugeot scripting across the back with the lion underneath, the 2008 badge here, and you get this very prominent rear bumper. Now, weirdly, it actually sticks out quite a bit from the car. It doesn't even coincide with this line, which I thought it did. It sticks out about a good inch and a half from the furthest point of the tailgate, which I find a little bit odd. Now, if you remember the triple claw design from the front, you'll see that same sort of motif repeated back here. The brake lights and the indicators are also within these tiny little white lines that are sort of built into the tail light, and it is a very smart looking rear end. There's also this little body colored spoiler with these little black panels here for aerodynamic purposes, and overall it looks quite good. What is interesting, of course, is the fact that this car actually comes with functional dual exhausts. Yes, these are 100% functional, which I think are an interesting choice, given the fact that everyone wants to try and hide their exhaust tips or try and fake the exhaust tips. But anyway, now, If you buy a crossover, you will be thinking about practicality, and the 288 doesn't really disappoint. This boot is quite large. It's a nice square shape and it is quite deep, which means you can get luggage in here quite easily. There are a couple of things worth noting, however. One, there is a very significant lip here, about that deep, which means if you want to haul things in and out, you will have to lift it over that lip. The other thing, of course, is this bumper, which as I said earlier, sticks out quite a bit. Now, this silver bit acts as sort of where, you know, this little bit of trim that you can replace if you scratch it, because there have been several scratches already, and I suspect that it's because people are having issues loading it in and out. The other thing, of course, is also this parcel shelf, which is not connected to the tailgate, which is a little bit weird, but at least the rear seats do fold 60/40 for added practicality. Now, the coolness of this car continues to the interior, so let's talk about that now. Now, inside the cabin of the 288, it certainly feels like a much more upmarket car than some of its competitors. For starters, you sit here and you are bathed and ensconced in all of these lovely materials. All the materials here, for example, this faux carbon fiber stuff, is soft touch. You get some leather on the doors, you get these lovely metal finish or metal-like finish door handles, which feel nice and solid. You even get ambient lighting in here, as well as these lovely leather seats, although I'm not really sure if they're leather. You also get climate control in this car, this freestanding instrument cluster, and up ahead of you, a digital instrument cluster that is not just digital, it's 3D. Now, the 3D system works by having one screen sort of embedded into the back, and then you have a layer of perspex at an angle, and then on top there is actually another screen that projects all of the information that needs to be closest to you onto that piece of perspex, which then reflects it to you. Now, the 3D system is not just a gimmick. The idea is that you have all of the unimportant information displayed to you at the rear, whereas the most important information to you, like safety systems, for example, and some warnings and so on, will be displayed on the screen that is closer to you. That way, your eyes can understand sort of what is more important for you to pay attention to. Now, of course, as with any modern Peugeot, this car does come with a rather unique driving position, where you have to position this small two-spoke steering wheel underneath the digital instrument cluster to get a better view. Now, of course, for smaller people like me, this is fine because I still have plenty of space between my thighs and the rim of the wheel. But for those of you who might be a little healthier, this might get in the way. And of course, in terms of the driving position, it's also worth pointing out that if you're a slightly taller individual, this might be a problem for you as well. My video editor, who is only a little bit taller than me, complained that getting into or finding a driving position in this car is a little bit odd because of the way this cabin is arranged. But now that's beside the point. Now, let's talk about the infotainment system. Now, Peugeot infotainment systems have always been a little bit of a hit and miss. You see, they like to have these nice piano buttons down here, which all feel very nice, and they all have a lovely action to them, and they're all this sort of brushed aluminium look, and that's all well and good. But the trouble is, a lot of the functionality of this car lies within this infotainment system. Now, number one, the screen is not that large. Number two, a lot of the functionality is accessed via these shortcut keys on either side. But what's most annoying of it all is, one, if I want to adjust the climate control, I have to press a climate button, which will then take me out of Android Auto, which this car comes with. And then to get back to Android Auto, I have to press the source button on the steering wheel. There's no visible way for me to go from the climate control to the Android Auto from the screen. That's number one. Number two, the screen itself is a little bit laggy. Now, I didn't experience this in the 388 nor the 588 when I sampled that very briefly. So I suspect that this is unique to this unit or perhaps to this car. So I guess BERMAZ needs to go back to Stellantis and say, hey, can we put some nicer sort of slightly stronger graphics in here, graphics cards in here in order to deal with all of that. The same thing goes with this 3D instrument cluster, which looks fantastic. Unfortunately, while it displays all the information like the speedo and the revs and all that quite quickly, the trouble is that swapping between the dials is a little bit slow. There is a noticeable lag between when you input something on the steering wheel and when it actually responds within the instrument cluster, which I find very odd. Now, in terms of practicality, you do have rather large door bins in here, but the pockets themselves don't go all the way far back on the door. You have a two-tier sort of shelf up ahead, which is very useful because this top tier allows you to sort of put your phone when you plug it in for Android Auto. You have a couple of cup holders here, the tiniest little center console, and then you have a typically French glove box, which is half the size because they couldn't be asked to move the fuse box from the left to right when converting this car from left to right hand drive. Now, in terms of space in the rear, there are really not many amenities to speak of. You don't get rear aircon vents, but I guess that's fine because the central vents have plenty of space to sort of get back here. You don't get a single cup holder back here. There is no center armrest, so they're not hiding in there. There are only bottle holders in the doors. You can't put cups there, otherwise they might tip over and spill onto your legs. And the front seat pockets are a little bit shallow. However, BERMAZ has given you this little net storage here, which is perfect for an iPod, which has been discontinued. Not that anyone's bought one in the last 5 years. And the thing is, in terms of the rear accommodation, I can tuck my feet in underneath, and when I stretch out like this, I do get some under thigh support, but as you can see, quite a lot of this is hanging. And of course, if I put my feet up like this, well, there's no thigh support to speak of. Now, the headrests are at least quite comfortable, but I do suspect that if you have child seats back here, because there are two ISOFIX mounts on either side, which are accessible via these little zips, which I'm not too sold on, children are going to have a tough time trying to see out of the rear windows because this window line goes up quite a bit. The other thing that I'd like to point out is the fact that the sill on this car is surprisingly high. Twice now I have tripped trying to get into this car, both at the front and the rear, because this is weirdly tall for a car like this. It's strange because when you want a crossover, it's because you want a higher driving position, and so having a slightly higher floor would be expected. And so you're not necessarily used to having this sort of lip. This feels like getting into a saloon or a hatchback, which is a little bit odd. And so this does mean that, of course, if you intend to ferry, say, elderly parents in this, you will have to let them know that there's a sill for them to step over rather than just glide into the seats. But yeah, I mean, also hope that mummy and daddy don't need water, because otherwise they'll have to drink out of your cups in the front, sort of reaching, very difficult with arthritis. But of course, this car is not meant to appeal to the elderly, because they'll most likely be put off by the way this car looks. This is not a Peugeot from the 1990s. No, this is a Peugeot of the here and now, as the number plate says very boldly, the lions of our time. So let's get into the driver's seat and see what this car is like to drive as a 20-something that should be able to afford one of these. Now, as I mentioned earlier in this review, the trouble with the 2008 is that it is more expensive than a Honda HR-V and significantly more expensive than a Proton X50. And because the X50 is such an accomplished car, you really do have to ask yourself, how does any other competitor sort of justify its premium? And behind the wheel of the Peugeot 2008, it might not be immediately apparent. Because as I mentioned earlier, in terms of boot space and in terms of interior practicality, sure, it shames the Mazda CX-3, but the CX-3 was never marketed as a particularly large car anyway. So that's not really very surprising. What is surprising, however, is that compared to the X50, which is notorious for being a bit cramped in it, it's still quite spacious in here. Now, over the period that we've had this car, my video editor took this car out to Pahang with his entire family in tow, so that's 5 up in here, plus an entire boot's worth of luggage. And surprisingly, not only did they not want to kill themselves or anyone else in the car after that drive, they were quite comfy in here, and there was absolutely no performance deficit to be reported. The best part is, out of all of that, the car continued to return an average of about 7.1 litres per 100 kilometers. That's Karak Highway, back roads, and traffic coming back. And despite that, the car continued to perform valiantly. Which means that, yes, this car might not be as large as a Honda HR-V, but is still very usable in that sense. And the icing on the cake is the refinement. So, as I mentioned earlier, this car comes with a full sense of, or rather a full suite of safety systems like AEB and blind spot monitoring and lane keep assist and all of that, which means it's quite comprehensively equipped, although it doesn't come with adaptive cruise control. Although, admittedly, in my opinion, that is still a little bit of a luxury. As long as it's got AEB and blind spot monitoring, we're fine. But when you're on the highway, this car is so quiet, even well north of the national speed limit, that it's good, really good. And I feel like that's where you find out why this car is so much more expensive. Because the X50 is known, for example, for having very terrible wind whistle from the wing mirrors at speeds above about 75-80 kilometers an hour. The HR-V, on the other hand, as with any Honda, is known for being quite noisy at speed, both in terms of wind noise as well as road roar. Whereas this car, it hides all of its noise really well. The 3-cylinder engine, for example, you feel some vibrations at idle, but once you're moving, there's nothing to it. And in terms of the tires, these Assurance Triple Max tires from Goodyear are surprisingly comfortable and surprisingly quiet. I certainly wouldn't have expected it from these tires, but there you are. And in terms of lateral grip, even though it's got relatively large sidewalls, which is great for your primary ride, and it absorbs the very worst lumps and bumps that the world can throw at you, despite all that, they provide an excellent amount of grip. And because this car is set up a little bit stiffer than the Honda HR-V, the body roll is very well controlled, which means you can really chuck this car about. Although I feel like I've segued into the driving portion. Okay, so we'll talk about the way this car handles now. As I said earlier, it's got very little body roll, which means you can carry a decent amount of speed through corners, and it will still instill you with a sense of confidence, meaning you can very easily travel in this car. For example, you and your spouse and 2 kids in the back, for example, you can drive this car quite confidently out on adventures and so on. And because of the refinement, it does mean that you can eat up those miles without having to be too concerned when it comes to how tired you'll be when you get there, because like I said, this car is very well insulated, both at the front and at the rear. This is of course added onto by the fact that this powertrain is very punchy. So as I mentioned earlier, there's a 1.2 litre PureTech turbocharged 3-cylinder up front, mated to a 6-speed ISIN automatic gearbox with power being sent to the front wheels. Now the amazing thing is that all of its torque is available very low in the rev range, and this gearbox is very smart in keeping you within that torque band, which means this car is amazingly responsive. There is little to no turbo lag, and there is almost no hesitation when you put your foot on the throttle in order to get going. And what that means is when you drive this car along, you can be very sure about where to place it on the road and just how much performance you have on tap. And because this engine is relatively brawny for its size, it means that when you're driving over longer distances, you're not getting a lot of engine note into the cabin. It's just a great place to be. Now, there are some downsides, however. For starters, the glove box in this car is pathetically small, although I think I mentioned that earlier. The side sills on the doors, I really thought I'd get used to it by now, but it's a bit odd that I have to lift my leg over the sill. It's not so bad when you're getting in, because if you trip into the car. When you're getting out, however, because this is a very stylish machine, and then you fall on your face when you get out. That's not so great. It also does mean that if you're trying to put elderly passengers in the back, you will have to warn them about that sill. It's a bit more difficult. Another really weird annoyance is actually the parcel shelf. So this car does come with a large parcel shelf. It's a stiff parcel shelf. You can't put it underneath the boot floor because the boot floor in this car is very low to maximize space. But that's not the problem. The problem is that the parcel shelf doesn't lift with the tailgate. Now, I don't know if that's a defect or a strange sort of quirk about this particular car, but it seems to me that the parcel shelf just doesn't lift. There's no string, there's no nothing, there's no mechanism that would make it lift with the tailgate. And that means that when you've got stuff all the way in like the furthest reaches of the boot, because this is a relatively large boot, it's very difficult to access. So you end up sort of having to lift it and then grab the thing from inside. A little bit weird. Of course, you can always just, put it somewhere, which is what my video editor did when he went over his long distance drive. But, that's another thing that would be, it's a small thing. Like, they could have just allowed it to lift with some string. If Toyota can do it for the GR Yaris, you can do it in this. The other thing that I find a little bit odd is that the blind spot monitoring is not as obvious, because there is a light on the wing mirror, but somehow it doesn't really get into my view. Not that I've arrived in situations where the blind spot monitoring should have warned me, but it's like when there is a vehicle there, it's either the light is dim or, I don't know, it just doesn't seem very obvious. So in terms of early warning, it's not really there. But if you do indicate when there is a car in your blind spot, it will beep at you, and that works just fine. But overall, as you can probably tell, these niggles are exactly that, they're niggles. These are very minor things to report because this car is, for the most part, very, very well spec'd. At 127,000 ringgit, it is on the more expensive side of the B segment crossover SUV space. Yes, there's absolutely no denying that. And if you're looking for the best bang for buck, the Proton X50 will not do you wrong, although the service centers will. The Honda HR-V is ultimately more practical if you want to carry people and things, but then you have to deal with the fact that it is incredibly noisy and relatively unrefined. The Mazda CX-3 is a better car to drive because it's a Mazda and they have magic zoom pixies in the car that make it wonderful. But if you're looking for a car that is comfortable, refined, relatively practical, at least for most of your needs, and has a certain sense of style to it, something that a lot of cars in this segment don't have, then the Peugeot 288 is most certainly worth considering. It is an excellent car. We've been very impressed with this, both in terms of the way it's presented as well as its powertrain, and it's become a very easy car to recommend. And it's very commendable that BERMAZ has fully spec'd out this car in terms of safety, which means that I can actually recommend this car without hesitation. In any case, that's been our very in-depth and thorough review of the new Peugeot 288 crossover. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, hit the little bell icon so you're notified every time we make a new upload. Don't forget to follow us on Facebook, Twitter and Instagram. All the links are in the description below. Thank you so much for watching. We'll catch you in the next one. Take care, stay safe, jangan bodoh.